Rabbi Herman, you are a rabbi's rabbi. We have so much to learn from you. And tonight we have the opportunity to ask you some questions. And I did share some of them with you, but I have to warn you, there will be some surprise curveballs, right?
Of course. Is this working?
Yeah. It's tempting to ask you to tell us all about what it was like to be a Jewish boy growing up in Mississippi and about your Aunt Bee and your family. But I think we need to jump to 1964. I believe, if my math is correct, 1964 would be the year you were ordained.
Correct.
That Rabbi Berlin spoke about. What a time to become a rabbi. What in God's name made you want to become a rabbi?
Well, in order to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about growing up in Mississippi,
Okay.
where there weren't very many Jews. I never dated, one time I think, I dated a Jewish girl when I was in high school. That was the rabbi's daughter. Everybody else in my town was related to me, and it's not fun to date your cousins. But I was very involved in youth group, NIFTY, and actually was president of our region, not when I was in high school, but when I was a freshman in college. And I had been an engineer. I always wanted to be an engineer until I found out that the high school I went to, which my late wife always reminded me was the only white high school in Jackson, Mississippi in the 50s. I really didn't have a very good education for being an engineer, and I'd always been interested in youth group and religion. I decided I'd give it a try. So after 2 years at Tulane, I went to Cincinnati, to the University of Cincinnati, and I lived at HUC. I have to tell you that I almost didn't become a rabbi then, because in those days, unlike today I think in order to be admitted to the Hebrew Union College, you have to know some Hebrew. We didn't have to know any Hebrew. We didn't even have to be able to read. We didn't even know the letters necessarily.
Well, you've come a long way.
Yeah, right. And language is not my greatest attribute. So we had to take a Hebrew readiness exam, it was called, at the end of the first year, I believe. I didn't pass. And I studied a little bit over the summer, and I didn't pass again. And they said, you can't go on. You got to drop out. I thought about going to law school, and a wonderful professor, a wonderful human being by the name of Sylvan Schwartzman, said, you want to be a rabbi? I said, yeah. He said, okay, come to my house once a week, bring Barbara, and I'll teach you Hebrew. And he taught me, for those of you who know Hebrew grammar, he taught me Ashkenazic, because my problem was I couldn't tell the difference between a Kometz and a Patak, hearing it. So Barbara and Sylvia, his wife, would have tea and watch Dr. Kildare while Rabbi Schwartzman, Dr. Schwartzman and I went up into the attic where his study was and learned Hebrew. He said, I'll teach you. The only thing you have to promise is if I ever call you and say, will you tutor somebody else, that you will. And I would. So I passed the exam. There's much more to the story, but we'll let it go at that. But I think I must attribute my becoming a rabbi first to my family, who, even though it was a very classical Reform congregation, were very, very committed to the congregation, went to services almost every Friday night, and to my experience in youth group. Those were the two things which impelled me. And then I got to Cincinnati, and of course, that's where I met Barbara, and the rest is history.
I'm thinking a lot about 1964, because 1964 was a year of an awful lot of turbulence
Yes.
in American society and
Yes.
also in the Jewish community. And it's so powerful that the founding rabbi of Har Sinai, Rabbi David Einhorn, right, he took a stand on justice and stood up against slavery. And you all know the story, but it seems to me that to become a rabbi in the 60s, you would have had to have had some of those social justice positions as well.
For the first 2 years, I couldn't do anything because I was in the Air Force. And when you're in the Air Force, you're not allowed. That was the Selma March. I would have loved to have gone, but you can't do that when you're an officer. of the U.S. government. But when I got out after 2 years, I got very, very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement in Houston. There were a group of us, rabbis, clergy, who would meet regularly. We were sure, we had the hubris to be sure that our meetings were being taped by the FBI or the CIA. I'm sure they weren't. And it was an interesting time. I had a youth group at Temple Emmanuel in Houston. Over 100 kids would show up for a meeting, mostly because they wanted to protest the war. They wanted to do Jewish things too, but they wanted to protest the war. You have to understand that at the same time, my senior rabbi, I was an assistant rabbi, Robert knew him, Rabbi Robert Kahn, a great rabbi. He was the first and probably only Jewish chaplain of the American Legion while I was talking anti-war stuff. It was an interesting time, but he was wonderful. He never said, you can't say that, and that taught me a lot.
And what about your congregation? Did they
Some
object
did,
to
some
your...
didn't. I'll tell you one quick story. When we invaded Cambodia, on the high holidays, I gave a very anti-war sermon. And we used to, I don't recommend this, Rabbi, we used to line up after services, every service, and people would come through the line and shake hands and say something to us. So somebody came through the line, I don't remember who, and said to me in a very loud voice, "That's the worst excuse for a sermon I've ever heard." Right behind him was the director of the ADL in Houston, who came and said, "That's the best sermon you've ever given."
And there you have it, right?
And there you have it, exactly.
And I imagine Rabbi Herman had a chance, together with Rabbi Berlin, to speak to the Baltimore Board of Rabbis a couple of weeks ago and share their reflections on how the rabbinate has changed. I'm wondering if there are different episodes or moments in your experience as a rabbi that you think are particularly relevant to help us all figure out how to engage with the moment and the challenges that we're facing.
Well, as I said that day, and I think it's true, the biggest change in my 60 years as a rabbi, are women rabbis. That has really changed everything, for the better, I think. I sometimes worry that...
God, he says it's for the better.
Thank
God you think it's for the better.
I sometimes worry that there aren't going to be any men in the rabbinate.
Oh, okay. Well, we actually have
yes.
a fifth-year rabbinic student here with us this evening. Jesse, remind me your last name? Jesse Epstein, who's interning at Third Space with Rabbi Jesse Dressen. And so, Jesse, we're so delighted that you could be here specifically this evening.
Right. Very good, yeah. And I think that really changed a lot of things. Some of you may remember, who were at Har Sinai, when I came here, we used the old Union prayer book for the holidays. I think we'd already gone...
And if you remember the old Union prayer book.
Oh, lots, right. I think we'd already gone to Gates of Prayer for Shabbat. And then I had a woman assistant, Sarah Herman, who said, I can't do this. It was very masculine oriented. I said, okay, well, let's see if we can change it. Well, instead of going through and doing it ahead of time, we tried to change it on the fly. It was very funny. Some of you might remember that. Changes. You know, everything has changed, and the world has changed, and sometimes for the better and sometimes not. As I was thinking about changes, the last 6 years of my life, you know, you think you get to a certain age and things are just going to be calm and you'll live and you'll enjoy. The last 6 years of my life have been among the most changeful of all. 6 years ago, I moved to Edenwald, and I really appreciate all of you who live at Edenwald for being here tonight. I am not the rabbi of Edenwald. I am a rabbi who happens to live at Edenwald. I'm sure Rabbi Berlin can relate to that. I do get rabbinic questions, and I don't mind, but I am not the rabbi of Edenwald. So that changed. Unfortunately, my wife passed away 4 years ago, and this merger came about during the last 6 years of my life. I mean, these are cataclysmic changes in my life personally. So I say that the only thing that's constant in this world is change. The world is changing all the time, every day. We can't go back and even live the last millisecond. We have to look forward, and I think that, you didn't ask me this, but I think that what this congregation and every institution needs is looking forward and not dwelling on the past. You know, Har Sinai used to say, we're the oldest continuously reformed congregation in the United States. I'm sorry to say this, I can say whatever I want. So what? What are you going to do tomorrow? Exactly. What are you going to do tomorrow? So those are the things that I think the congregation is doing well, even though I'm not a part of it. I don't participate in board meetings, thank God, or strategic planning meetings or anything like that. But that's, I think, what keeps institutions of all kinds. I'm on the board of Edenwald, the big board, and we just participated in a retreat. And the theme, if there was a theme, was how are we going to get people who come here to live as fully as they can for as long as they can. Forward-looking, not what we've done, but what we're going to do.
Speaking of which,
Yeah.
if I can be forward-looking with you for a moment, and obviously the last couple of years in terms of Israel and also in terms of America have been incredibly dramatic. And I know that you have been an inspiration and have had the opportunity to take some strong stands when it comes to Israel and also when it comes to American politics, and you've played a very important role in the BJC and other organizations here in Baltimore. So when I look forward, of course, we're all praying for peace, and many of us are hoping for a change. This is now just my personal opinion. Some of us are hoping for a change in the Israeli government, and some of us are, I think all of us are kind of concerned about, one way or another, about what might happen in November and, of course, in January. And I'm wondering if there's some wisdom that you can give us as we look forward around these two major shifting nations that we call home.
Thanks for the softball question. Rabbi told me that I could say whatever I want about American politics. I can say the things that she can't say, because really there's not much you can do to me. I wish I had a solution for what's going on in Israel. I really believe, for myself personally, that it's time to just say, for the Israelis to say, you guys won, we're going to call a halt and try to get some. I mean, now they say there may only be 50 hostages left alive. I mean, what's happened the last 8 months? I agree. I think this government, and I thought this before October 7th, I think the Israeli government is awful. I thought that it was going to be that way from the minute it was formed because of the people who are in it, and you and Ofer know much more about it than I do, but it disturbs me. As far as the United States is concerned, you want to know who I'm going to vote for? I'm trying to keep this as apolitical as I can. It would be very difficult, and most of you know where I stand, it would be very difficult for me to vote for someone who is not only a convicted felon, but a misogynist, I think a racist. I think he verges on the edge of anti-Semitic, even though he has Jewish daughter-in-law and son, I guess, daughter and son-in-law. So leaving all politics aside, forgetting the issues, because I don't think this is really an election about issues. I just find it difficult to even imagine that a country as great as the United States of America would make a person like that its president.
While we uphold all the regulations about what it means to be a 501c3 in a religious institution.
I did not mention any names.
No, you didn't. I was saying while we continue to uphold those regulations, what do you think that we as a congregation with our values should be doing right now?
Well, I think everybody who's serious about being an American should vote. Number one, vote. And if you say, I don't know who to vote for, write somebody's name in. I don't care, but go to the polls and vote. You know who I would like for you to vote for, but if you cannot possibly vote for that person, at least go and vote. I worked the polls at the last presidential election. It's a very interesting experience. I can't do it again because it's a lot, many hours, starting at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and I can't stand up that long, and there's a lot of standing up. But it's so important for everybody to vote. Beyond voting, you can go and make phone calls. I've done that in the past. There are plenty of places to make phone calls, to send postcards. There are lots of things that we can do. And I think the sad thing about this country, if I had to say, there are a couple of sad things about this country. First of all, I think the country as a whole, no one in this room, of course, as a whole, is terribly uninformed. That's the kind of country we live in, sadly, and terribly uninvolved. And I think it's our duty as citizens to be as involved as we possibly can. And that's, I don't think, whatever your point of view is, whichever side you're on, and unfortunately there seem to be two sides now, get involved. That's the most important thing.
You and I were talking about a major conference in the Reform movement that took place in New York just
Yes.
a couple weeks ago, where I spoke, called Recharging Reform Judaism. And one of the purposes of that organization, it's really almost a break-off of the Reform movement, but it's within it at the moment, is to say that Reform Judaism has become too universal and too peace-oriented and not particular enough and not focused on who we are and what we need. And given the rise of, something like Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, was there and spoke about the 900% increase in anti-Semitism in America. And I think we could all benefit from your reflections on that and perhaps how we should respond.
I'm not sure how to respond to anti-Semitism. I've taught classes in anti-Semitism for a long time, both at Loyola and in adult programs. It's got a very long and inglorious history, but still around, and nobody's figured out how to solve the problem yet. I think as far as the movement is concerned, movements go back and forth, up and down. One of the great experiences of my rabbinate was to be on the Commission for Religious Living, it eventually was called, where we introduced the idea of spirituality into Reform Judaism. There were those who said, and there are those who still say, Reform Judaism is all about social action and nothing else. Well, the kind of service that we had here tonight did not exist in the early 80s in the Reform, maybe a few places, but not most part, not in my congregation. I don't know about your congregation, Don, but it certainly, there wasn't as much Hebrew. There wasn't as much participation, and one of the things that this commission did was to try to get, for example, tomorrow morning we're going to study Torah, as we have for many, many years. When I came here, people tell me this at Edenwald, they say they can't hear me. I've been a public speaker for 60 years. It's okay. When I came here, we didn't have Torah study. On Shabbos morning, we did have a Bible class that met mostly women every week. But if the Torah was going to be read, it was read by the rabbi. We did have a cantor. Yeah, he could do that, I guess, but I'm trying to think. You know, we have trained a whole generation and more of Jews, first of all, to love study, to be able to do more Jewish things like chanting Torah, like conducting services. I mean, we could, Rabbi Berlin, you, me, the cantor Gerber, we could all leave and somebody else would lead the service. We have trained people to do that, and that's a big change. So I think there's always been I wouldn't say conflict, but I can't think of a better word, between those who are ritually oriented and those who are social action oriented. And the question that we had in those days was, how do we get all those people who are so committed to doing social justice to appreciate the ritual as well? Did we succeed? I don't know. Are we still in a place where we are too universal? I don't know. I think it's a tension, and I would hope that it would be a healthy tension. It wouldn't be one against the other, but it would be, as Rabbi Alexander Schindler of blessed memory used to say, and others, it's not either or, it's both and. And I think that's where the movement needs to go. I don't know what's going to happen to this group. Some of the things I've heard disturb me considerably, but I wasn't there, and I haven't looked at all the addresses. I did watch yours.
I did want to ask you about one thing that came up there, and we can
Okay.
use this as a segue to a final question, really about God. But before we get there, I'm curious as to what your position would be about an issue that came up, which is whether or not the Hebrew Union College should ordain rabbis who are anti-Zionist or determined to be anti-Zionist. And I'm curious as to what you think about that.
My first question, when we had this brief discussion, was how do you define Zionism? I mean, I've also taught a class on the history of Zionism. For every 10 Jews, there's been a different definition of Zionism. And if you read the history of Zionism, you know that sometimes they fought against each other, even in Israel. The Irgun and the Palmach didn't get along, and they actually fought each other. So, right, Ofer? Yeah, not to mention the revisionist Zionists, the Jabotinskyites, I think they're still around.
But they were all Zionists, and they agreed that we have the right to
yeah,
our
so
homeland.
I don't know what you mean. If you say anti-Zionist, do you mean dedicated to, if necessary, to the destruction of the state of Israel?
I think that when the proposal came up, it was essentially saying that those, students who are participating in truly not just anti-war, but anti-Israel demonstrations, that perhaps those aren't students who should be ordained or even admitted, actually.
Well,
there's a question about could they be admitted, but is there not would you say there's something in Reformed doctrine that would say you must be, of any range of definition
it's hard for
in support of the Jewish state?
It's hard for me to know the answer. Are there lines? I just got an email from the president of the Hebrew Union College, which says that students who want to be rabbis and who are married to non-Jews will be admitted. I don't know how I feel about that.
It's a big change. It's been in process for years.
I know it's been in process for years, and they've talked about it, but even so, when you finally come down to the line and say, this is okay, or when you finally come to the point where you say to a student, you don't have to support the state of Israel, I have a problem. I think that the difference between among all the sort of strands of Judaism is where do we put the boundaries? And sometimes can the boundaries get too low? I imagine they can. But I wouldn't want to make them so high that a lot of people get left out. But I have to think about it because I heard that was what was being proposed. I also heard Dr. Raphael's talk there, where he strongly supported admitting people who might not be as Zionist as you want. I don't know if he said anti-Zionist, but yeah, I think they're, you know, what does it take to be a rabbi? When we were ordained, I don't know about you, but when we were ordained, the president of the Hebrew Union College, Nelson Glick, would bring us into the chapel at Cincinnati the night before ordination. And he would take the Torah and pass it around from one to the other, and he would say, cherish it. Now, if you say that real fast, it gets to be funny. But he didn't say you have to believe in God. He didn't say you have to follow 613 commandments. He said you have to love Torah, and by extension, I would say you have to love Jewish people. There was a professor in New York who supposedly said, in order to be a good rabbi, you don't have to love Judaism, you have to love Jewish people. Well, if you love the Jewish people, how can you not love the state of Israel?
Amen. Thinking about the Jewish people and the state of, definitely, if you agree, applaud. So there's the Jewish people, there's the state of Israel. What about God? I'm curious.
What about God?
I'm curious, I'm pretty sure that when I met you in the 1980s, you didn't have a kippah on your head.
No.
And I'd love for you to reflect a little bit about your relationship with God.
Well, I don't think I put on a kippah because of my relationship with God. If I can find it, I'll send you the sermon that I gave. We used to not have services. We used to have services all together in one place in the summer. So when I came back, I had decided that I was going to wear a kippah for a lot of reasons, and I gave a whole long sermon about it because I didn't want people to come on the high holidays and see me with a kippah and say, what is going on? Some did. But I sent out a letter to the congregation. I think I'm not sure that I wear, and I'd have to go back and look, that I wear a kippah because of my belief in God, although I do believe in God. But living in this community, there were so many places that I went where, to Levinson's, you put on a kippah, to a conservative synagogue, you put on a kippah, things like that it felt comfortable to me, and that's why I started to do it. Now, as far as God is concerned, I have I think, rather, I guess esoteric is the right word, view of God, which is kind of a mixture of Kabbalism and Buberism, and which I think are related. And I've thought about it for a long, long time, 86 years, I guess. And for me, this God works. It's not a God who sits up in heaven and, pulls all the strings. It's not even a God who is perfect. That'll disturb some people. It's a God who is dynamic. And I think that's what the Kabbalists are trying to say, and who changes. And the world changes, God changes, we change, everything changes. Now, for a lot of people, that may not be very satisfactory, but you probably haven't thought about this as much as I have. You have.
Well, I bless us all that we will have many, many more years and many more opportunities to study with you and to learn from you,
Thank you.
And to celebrate Torah and the Jewish people and our love of God together.
Thank you. And before I put the microphone down, I want to tell you, I thank you, Rabbi Sabbath. This was her idea, not mine. And she said, why don't we do this? And I really appreciate it. I will also make an offer to people who live at Edenwald. I come here almost every Saturday morning at 8:30 to study Torah. I have a car that will easily hold 4 people, maybe 5, and I come here almost every Friday night for services. You're welcome to come, but if you come, like tonight, you're going to miss dinner.
And what a perfect segue into Kiddush and Motzi. Thank you, Rabbi Herman. We are just all so blessed to have you in our midst and to have you as our rabbi.
"25 high holiday sermons, at least here, and never got a standing ovation.